I love the idea of cities in video games. A bustling new place to explore with striking architecture, characters to meet and side quests to do, secrets to find. But in practice, cities in video games are always made with compromises. Their size, interactivity, reactivity, depth, graphics. It seems like some things always have to be dialed back to meet the realities of video game development. I enjoy thinking about what a video game city with no compromises could look like, how it could function, and what it could play like. Here are my thoughts, and if you're developing a game with a city, consider this general design advice from a player's perspective, whatever that's worth. Let's start with the look of the city. Whether the city is futuristic, medieval, modern, or alien, there are some design choices that will improve the look of the city no matter the setting. Making a strong first impression is important, because it's the visual impression that will drive the player's desire to explore and engage with the city. The basic makeup of the city should be layered with different levels of verticality. It should look like people can interact with the city at different altitudes. Sky bridges connecting the buildings, stairs and fire escapes between the rooftops, or exterior elevators can help achieve this. The design of the buildings themselves should spring from simple geometric shapes, with smaller details added afterward. This keeps the silhouette of the buildings readable, so that they can look complex without losing themselves among the other buildings. Horizon Forbidden West is a good example of this mistake. There's a lot of good work here, but it's all cannibalized by how noisy everything is. Too much high-frequency detail, too many little shapes breaking up the silhouettes until my eyes can't clearly make anything out. Oppositely, here's a town in the same game that does a good job of using large basic shapes and adding detail on top to make a striking and readable image. If the city is supposed to be dense, every structure should contribute to the perception of that density. So the shorter structures should not be hidden behind the tall ones. And there could be certain details like flags and various other kinds of cloth flowing in the wind to create subtle movement and life to the image. Things like spinning fans, perching birds, swaying power lines, and blinking lights can also contribute to this perception of density. The way light plays off of materials can also trick the eye into perceiving movement. And so having good material diversity in the city will also make it look more lively without actually adding any animations. Creating different levels of elevation in the terrain can also be beneficial. You can make your streets and roads wind up and down, hiding and revealing parts of the city as you walk, and you can use that elevation to imply importance to some structures, like here in The Witcher 3 where the whole city of Toussaint is crowned with the royal palace. Or you might subvert expectations and place typically important buildings at the lowest elevations. Whatever your artistic choice here, try to make the shape of the city's foundation contribute to the story you're trying to tell about this place, or the feelings you're trying to evoke. The structures on top of that foundation should have different shapes. It seems like obvious advice, but so often I see video game cities with very monotone shape language. Having differently shaped buildings gives the impression that the buildings have different uses, which then creates the illusion not only of architectural density, but architectural diversity. When some of the buildings have exotic shapes, the player will wonder and imagine the exotic uses of those buildings. You know you've done a good job if the players look at your buildings and think, what goes on in there? There's some great examples of this in Mass Effect Andromeda's ancient alien cities. Give the player's imagination fuel so that their imagination will work for you. Zooming out, the composition of those buildings, how those buildings are placed around the city, should lead the eye in a direction. Depending on the artistic goals of the game, the eye might be led upward to belittle the player with towering height, or the eye might be led horizontally to highlight breadth. This is often done in shanty towns or slums to create a feeling of overwhelming and vast poverty. The eye might also be led along sweeping or curving lines. This can evoke an organic or fluid feeling to the city, as opposed to the shapes that draw the eye along jagged edges, evoking a hostile feeling. If you make the shapes of your city work for you in these ways, you can establish a lot of tone and feeling before the player even begins any interactions. Video games often have waypoints or on-screen markers to let you know where points of interest are. If you design the city with guiding lines, readable shapes, and interesting geometry, you'll ignite the interest in the player, and you won't need to overly rely on those hinting systems. There's a lot more to be said on the look of an ideal city. Things like material quality, lighting, and colors. But much of that will depend on the game you're making and your personal artistic goals. Keeping the city visually readable, however, will always help you in those artistic goals, whatever they may be. Now let's talk about how the city functions. The inside of the city should fulfill the promises made by that first visual impression you worked so hard to make. To do this, we'll use what I'll call a person-first design methodology. Cities are made by people, for people. So ask yourself questions about the people to drive your design choices. People are born, so there should be places where that happens. People eat food. What do the people of this city eat, and where does that food come from? As a player, I should see the various sources of that food, like restaurants and markets, shipping ports, or farmsteads. Maybe your city is full of alien plant people and they subsist only on water and sunlight, but they too might have infrastructure to reflect that. If people eat, they also poop. Where does that poop go? It surprises me how many open world games have no bathrooms. All those people, just holding it in for eternity. Not only might there be bathrooms, but sewers and sanitation workers. Interestingly, most video games also don't have children. This is usually because if the player can harm those children in any way, the game will automatically get an M for mature rating, which games typically try to avoid. This absence of kids might also be in part because child character models are more difficult to make and usually look ugly and creepy, so most game developers just avoid them entirely. I want kids in an ideal city, and places for them to learn and play. Kids give your population a life cycle, as do old people. Don't forget them. If the people in your city work, then that also means they might commute. What do their vehicles look like? How wide are their roads? Ideally, each person would have a full daily and weekly schedule. The Elder Scrolls games, like Skyrim, usually have a simple implementation of this. You can follow any individual around and watch them go about their day and go to bed at night. I imagine a robust version of this system, where each day is a little different for each person. And some places are visited more often than others, and different people interact with each other as they connect and separate along their individual schedules. And each person should have different activities depending on certain factors like wealth, family status, age, or species. Does the city have crime, and how much? Does the city have a government? Does the government care about the people? Those things should be reflected in some way. Does the city have weather? Most games where it can rain, you won't see an umbrella. It's a small but common oversight. In The Witcher 3, people hide from the rain, so that's a nice touch. And in Cyberpunk 2077, the developer actually updated the game long after release to add umbrellas. Another often neglected detail is pets. Cities are full of pets, but because animals are difficult to animate, we rarely see them in game cities. Other animals could make an appearance too, like more exotic creatures climbing on the buildings. Cities are actually classified as their own natural ecosystem for animals, an urban biome where some animals thrive. I'd like to walk through an alleyway and spot a raccoon rummaging through the trash, or some equivalent that fits the city's setting. Yet another important factor to consider when making a city is its history. There should be older structures and maybe entire districts that are clearly part of the city's past. And at the same time, a constant in cities of all kinds is construction. Things are constantly being built or repaired or renovated in a city. Having structures that reflect the timeline of this place adds a third dimension to the setting. While I as a player may only be able to interact with the present day of this place, the past and future should still occupy my imagination, letting me as the player fill in more details than the developer created. Speaking of construction, people make noise. All the aspects of the city, its weather, the people, the vehicles and buildings and everything else, should have a sound signature. Machinery makes all kinds of noises. Construction is notoriously loud. Pedestrians converse and argue, and music can come from many different sources. As I walk through the city, all this audio should create a soundscape that reflects the tone and activity of my surroundings. Oftentimes, video game cities will have an audio track playing that includes a bunch of general city and people noises. But I think it's important for the sounds to actually come from specific sources and compound into a soundscape, one that naturally changes as you walk into and out of the range of various noises. That way, you can get the iconic experience of walking towards a sound source, like a boombox or a jackhammer or market stall shouting, the noise growing louder and louder until you pass it and leave the noise slowly fading behind you as you walk away. The modern Spiderman games are guilty of underserving the dimension of sound in their depiction of New York City. There is noise here, sure, but compared to real New York City, this place is eerily quiet.
Hey, turn this way.
But maybe your city is serene and quiet. Whatever the case, unless the city takes place in a scientifically accurate vacuum of space, there will be some noises. Don't underestimate this aspect of city life. Treat the sounds as a tool to strengthen the character of the city, rather than as an afterthought the way many video games do. The city being simulated in all these ways sets up a strong foundation for the third and final pillar of a great video game city: the player's interaction. The player interaction is typically the most compromised part of a video game city. And for good reason. It takes extraordinary effort to implement gameplay systems, and making enough of them to satisfy a fully simulated city is currently not possible. But I'm imagining a city with no compromises, and a dynamic city requires dynamic play. When I walk into this lively city, my mind should race with things I want to do. And in my ideal world, I'm able to do most of them. Can I go into that building? Yes. Can I get onto the rooftops? Yes. Can I talk to that person? Yup. Their outfit looks cool. Can I get it somewhere and wear it myself? Yes. I want the city to tell me yes more than it tells me no. And when it does tell me no, it should do it in a way that respects me as a player. How many times have you played a game where you're a super-powered character with extraordinary abilities, and yet a locked door is your greatest obstacle? Or sometimes it's just a small pile of waist-high rubble blocking your path, forcing you to make a huge detour. Not in my city. I want my player character to believe that if they really want to do something, they can almost always find a way. And I want them to express that belief through gameplay. If the city feels like it respects me in this way, it will also earn my respect, and as a result, my investment and confidence in the game world will grow. This has a knock-on effect of changing player behavior. If the city says yes to the question, "Can I climb through that window?" then the city might also answer yes to the question, "Will I get in trouble if I climb through that window?" and I might reconsider that action. How much freedom you give the player to be a menace will depend on the specific design goals of that game and its story, but in all cases, a reactive world will instill a confidence in the player. Confidence in the freedom the world allows, as well as a confidence in the world's limitations. There are a lot of ways that the ideal city earns the player's confidence. A day-night cycle and different weather events if the setting is applicable. Interesting shops with items to buy that you can only get in the city. A wealth of new outfits to wear and pedestrians to talk to. There should be multiple modes of traversal. This can include walking and climbing, various vehicles, using your superpowers to get around or your gadgets. No matter what they are, there should be multiple of them available to the player. Even if it's just 2 choices, you are giving the player agency in moving their character, their most frequently used gameplay ability. And in the best case, the movement abilities can intermingle with each other, like in Batman Arkham Knight, where you can combine the grapple, running, driving, and gliding abilities, making the movement around the city its own gameplay loop. Whatever the traversal methods, they'll never feel quite right if the city doesn't have proper scale. Cities are massive, and most games don't accurately reflect that. Manhattan in Marvel's Spider-Man is about 1/3 scale, and it feels that way. When I look up at a skyscraper in real life, I get a little vertigo. Walking around a whole building takes time. A big part of why landmarks like the New York City Public Library are impressive is because of their size. So if I'm playing in a city, I should feel that size. I should feel dwarfed by the city. Standing at the top of a tall building should be unnerving. Standing at the top of a skyscraper should be stomach-dropping. But in Spider-Man, the whole city feels inconsequential because of its miniature size. In Assassin's Creed Unity, Paris is the setting, and it too has a miniature scale. But there is one building in the game that is 1-to-1 scale: Notre Dame. Using this building as an example, you can see the difference proper scale makes. The building is massive compared to every other structure around it. And the whole city would be this much more imposing and interesting to climb all over if the scale matched reality. A big city needs a lot of quests, and quests of different sizes. I think a good video game city should have an activity for every mood. If I just want a short gameplay-focused mission, I should know where to get one. If I'm in the mood for a more substantial mission with some story in it, there should be some characters to go to for those. If I just need some currency to buy that new upgrade or outfit I want, there should be little odd jobs all over the city to make a quick buck. And of course, there should be spontaneous events that blossom into quests that I can stumble upon. I also think the side quests should intentionally take you to places you might not have gone yourself. Batman Arkham Knight does a good job of this. If you do all the optional missions in the game, you will have seen many of the coolest interiors and environments that the main game doesn't pull you towards. It gave me a reason to go on more side missions because I knew that it might take me to a cool new place in the city I hadn't seen yet. I think another iconic experience of exploring a city is getting lost. So the ideal video game city is big enough to lose yourself in. And I'd avoid a minimap as much as possible. I think a heads-up display like this kills a lot of the joy from an environment. A better implementation would be something like in Horizon, where you can tap a button and bring up the compass for a few seconds if you're lost, before it fades away again. Distinct districts of the city with different spoken languages and different design sensibilities can alleviate the frustration of getting lost. And memorable landmarks help the player form a mental map so that they can reference the actual map as little as possible and stay present in the game world as much as possible. Having those distinct districts is also a great opportunity to have player housing options. If I grow to love this city, let me live in it. give me at least one place to call my own and customize a little bit too. Cyberpunk has over 5 different apartments the player can buy, each in a different district, with the apartment interior reflecting the flavor of that part of the city. So if Japantown is your favorite part of Night City, you can call it home. Skyrim also does a good job of this, with every major city in the game having a home you can buy. I would want the city to go even further and provide customization options where you can choose the layout and colors of the whole space, as well as engage the economy of the game by having furniture and other things for sale in the city shops. A common problem in open world games is the player having too much money and not enough to spend it on. The economy in the game then becomes trivial, and money ceases to have value in the gameplay experience. So having tangible things to spend money on keeps the economy and monetary quest rewards meaningful. There's a lot more to be said on what an ideal video game city could be, but I'll make a last point about the persistence of the game world. Modern games pull in data from your storage drive constantly as you play, drawing in the game world in front of you and removing it behind you. They do this to put as much game data, like textures, geometry, and animation, in your field of view, and many things outside of your field of view are culled to save on RAM and keep the frame rate optimal. This makes sense to do, but it can also mean that when you're walking around the city, parts of the game world can noticeably disappear or change as you look around, like passing a person on the street and turning around to see it's now a completely different person, because the game loaded, unloaded, and reloaded a character model. My ideal city would keep all those painstaking details persistent, even so far as keeping a particular object exactly where I left it, even if I go to the other side of the city. It's a small example, but it exemplifies the kind of cohesion that I want in the ideal city, where the sights and sounds come from a connected system, and not just triggered events that play when certain conditions are met. So a lot of games get some of the pieces of the formula right, but never the whole thing. I'm glad games continue to attempt large-scale cities, in spite of how difficult they are. Cities are infinitely complex, because people are infinitely complex. But I hope, with enough advancements in technology, video games can one day achieve, or maybe even surpass, my most optimistic expectations. Thanks for watching.